The chairman of the board had never bowed to anyone in his 80 years of life. But on December 27, 1995, Frank Sinatra fell to his knees beside Dean Martin's casket and whispered words that would haunt everyone who heard them for the rest of their lives. The man who had commanded presidents, intimidated mob bosses, and controlled every room he entered was reduced to a broken, sobbing figure, clutching the polished wood that separated him from his best friend forever. What Frank whispered in that moment of complete emotional collapse wasn't just a goodbye. It was a confession of love, loss, and survivor's guilt that revealed the depth of a friendship that had sustained both men through 40 years of triumph and tragedy. The words he spoke to Dean's lifeless body would become the most heartbreaking moment in the history of celebrity grief, proving that even legends are just human beings who can be destroyed by the loss of someone irreplaceable. The scene that unfolded at Pierce Brothers' Westwood Village Memorial Park, that gray December afternoon, would forever change how people understood the private cost of public friendship. Here was Frank Sinatra, the man who had sung My Way as an anthem of independence and control, completely surrendering to grief so profound that it stripped away every defense mechanism he had built over 8 decades of living. The funeral attendees, Dean's children, grandchildren, longtime friends, and industry colleagues found themselves witnessing not just the burial of an entertainment legend, but the psychological dismantling of another legend who couldn't imagine existence without his closest companion. The breakdown that would shatter Frank Sinatra's legendary composure began 3 days earlier when he received the phone call that he had been dreading for years. Dean Martin was gone. The man who had been Frank's anchor, his voice of reason, his closest friend, and the only person who truly understood the loneliness that came with their level of fame, had died quietly in his Beverly Hills home on Christmas Day. For Frank, who was battling his own declining health at age 80, Dean's death wasn't just the loss of a friend. It was the final confirmation that he was now the last surviving member of the brotherhood that had defined his life for 4 decades. Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin's friendship had survived everything that Hollywood could throw at 2 enormous egos: professional competition, romantic rivalries, business disputes, and the natural tensions that come when 2 alpha males share the spotlight. They had weathered Dean's withdrawal from public life after his son's death in 1987, Frank's various health scares, and the gradual dissolution of the Rat Pack as its members aged and died. Through it all, their bond had remained constant, built on mutual respect, shared experiences, and the kind of unconditional loyalty that both men valued above fame, money, or public approval. Their friendship had been forged in the crucible of 1950s Las Vegas, when they were young enough to believe they were invincible, and successful enough to prove it night after night on the stages of the Sands, the Copa, and the Fontainebleau. They had shared women, whiskey, and secrets that would have destroyed lesser friendships. Frank had been there when Dean struggled with the end of his partnership with Jerry Lewis. Dean had been there when Frank's career nearly collapsed in the early 1950s before his comeback in From Here to Eternity. Most importantly, they had understood each other's essential loneliness, the price that came with their level of fame, and the isolation that accompanied being 2 of the most recognizable faces in America. Frank had always known that Dean was the one person who saw through his public persona to the insecure kid from Hoboken underneath. Dean had always trusted that Frank would defend him against anyone who questioned his talent or his character. But Frank had always assumed that he would die first. He was older than Dean by 2 years. He had lived a more physically demanding lifestyle, and his health had been more visibly deteriorating. Frank had prepared himself psychologically to be the one who was mourned, not the one who would have to do the mourning. Dean's death had left Frank in the impossible position of being the sole survivor of a friendship that had been the most important relationship in both their lives. The funeral arrangements for Dean Martin had been handled quietly by his family, who wanted a dignified service that reflected Dean's preference for privacy over spectacle. The service was scheduled for 2 p.m. at Pierce Brothers' Westwood Village Memorial Park, and the guest list included Dean's children, grandchildren, close family friends, and a select group of entertainment industry colleagues who had known him personally rather than professionally. Frank's attendance at the funeral was never in question, despite his own physical frailties. He was suffering from dementia, heart problems, and the general weakness that comes with advanced age. But there was no force on earth that could have prevented him from saying goodbye to Dean. Frank's staff had arranged for a wheelchair and medical assistance to ensure that he could participate in the service safely, but Frank himself was focused entirely on the emotional rather than physical challenges of the day. On the morning of the funeral, Frank's longtime assistant, Dorothy Uleman, helped him dress in a black suit that had been tailored to accommodate his diminished frame. Frank had lost significant weight in recent years, and his once imposing physical presence had been reduced to a frail shadow of his former self. But his eyes still carried the intensity that had made him one of the most compelling performers of his generation, and his voice, though weakened, retained the authority that had commanded respect from kings and criminals alike. "Dorothy," Frank said as she adjusted his tie, his voice carrying the weight of impending loss, "I don't know if I can do this. Losing Dean, it's like losing part of myself. It's like they're burying half of who I am." Dorothy had worked for Frank for over 20 years and had never seen him display such vulnerability. Throughout their professional relationship, Frank had maintained the persona of a man who was in complete control of his emotions and his circumstances. But Dean's death had stripped away that protective facade, revealing the frightened, lonely old man underneath. "Mr. Sinatra," Dorothy replied gently, "you're going to say goodbye to your best friend. That's all you have to do today. Just say goodbye." Frank nodded, but his hands were shaking as he picked up the prepared eulogy that he was scheduled to deliver during the service. He had written and rewritten the speech dozens of times over the past 3 days, trying to find words that could adequately express what Dean had meant to him and what his loss represented, but every draft had felt inadequate to the task of summarizing a 40-year friendship that had been the foundation of Frank's emotional life. The drive from Frank's Beverly Hills home to the Memorial Park took less than 30 minutes, but for Frank, it felt like a journey into a future that he wasn't prepared to face. He sat in the back seat of his limousine, staring out the window at the familiar streets of the city where he and Dean had built their careers, shared countless meals, and created memories that would die with Frank because there was no one left who had been there to share them. Every landmark they passed carried memories that now felt like wounds. The restaurant where he and Dean had celebrated Frank's Academy Award for From Here to Eternity. The recording studio where they had laughed until they cried while trying to record a Christmas album. The hotel where they had stayed up all night planning their next Vegas residency, believing they would perform together forever. Each memory was both precious and unbearable, a reminder of what he had lost and what he would never have again. When Frank arrived at Pierce Brothers' Westwood Village Memorial Park, he was immediately struck by the modest size of the gathering. This wasn't the massive public spectacle that would have accompanied the death of a performer at the height of his fame, but rather an intimate service for family and close friends who wanted to honor Dean's memory with dignity rather than publicity. The absence of media attention and celebrity guests made the occasion feel more genuine and more heartbreaking. Frank was helped from his limousine into a wheelchair, a concession to his physical limitations that he found both necessary and humiliating. Throughout his career, Frank had prided himself on his energy, his stamina, and his ability to command any stage or room through sheer force of personality. Being reduced to wheelchair dependency was a reminder of his own mortality that made Dean's death feel even more devastating. The chapel where the service was being held was decorated with arrangements of white roses and photographs that chronicled Dean's life from his childhood in Steubenville, Ohio, through his partnership with Jerry Lewis, his solo career, his membership in the Rat Pack, and his final years as a beloved but increasingly reclusive entertainer. Frank studied the photographs as he was wheeled into the chapel, remembering the contexts in which most of them had been taken, and feeling the weight of being the sole surviving witness to many of the moments they depicted. Dean's casket was positioned at the front of the chapel, surrounded by floral arrangements and illuminated by soft lighting that gave the entire scene a peaceful, almost ethereal quality. Frank had seen many caskets over the years. The entertainment industry had lost numerous friends and colleagues during his long career, but seeing Dean's casket affected him in a way that nothing had prepared him for. This wasn't just another funeral. This was the end of the most important friendship of his life. The service began with remarks from Dean's son Richie, who spoke about his father's kindness, his devotion to family, and his ability to bring joy to millions of people while maintaining his own dignity and privacy. The eulogy was touching and appropriate, but Frank found it difficult to concentrate on the words because he was struggling to accept the reality that Dean was actually gone. Frank's own eulogy was scheduled to be delivered near the end of the service, and as the moment approached, he felt his composure beginning to deteriorate. The speech he had prepared suddenly seemed inadequate and impersonal, a collection of anecdotes and observations that failed to capture the essence of what Dean had meant to him personally. Frank realized that no prepared remarks could express the depth of his loss or the significance of the friendship he was mourning. When Frank was wheeled to the front of the chapel to deliver his eulogy, he looked out at the assembled mourners and then down at Dean's casket. The prepared speech in his hands suddenly felt like a barrier between himself and the authentic expression of grief that the moment demanded. Frank set the speech aside and began to speak from his heart. Dean Martin was, Frank began, but his voice caught in his throat. He tried again. Dean was the best friend I ever had. He was the brother I never had. Frank's voice broke completely, and he was unable to continue speaking. The man who had performed for presidents and kings, who had sung through personal tragedies and professional disappointments, who had maintained his composure through decades of public scrutiny, was unable to find words adequate to express his grief. The chapel fell silent as Frank struggled to regain his composure, but it quickly became clear that he wasn't going to be able to complete his prepared remarks. Instead of returning to his wheelchair, Frank did something that shocked everyone present. He asked to be helped to Dean's casket so that he could say goodbye privately. Frank's wheelchair was positioned beside Dean's casket, and with assistance from 2 funeral attendants, Frank managed to stand on unsteady legs and lean over the polished wood that contained his best friend's body. What happened next would become one of the most emotionally devastating moments in the history of celebrity grief. Frank collapsed to his knees beside the casket, his fragile body unable to support the weight of his emotions. He placed both hands on the casket and began to speak in a voice that was barely audible to most of the people in the chapel, but those who were close enough to hear would never forget what he said. "Dean," Frank whispered, his voice breaking with every word, "you weren't supposed to leave first. We had a deal, remember? We were supposed to go out together, on top, like we always did. You weren't supposed to leave me alone up here. Not like this. Not when I'm too old and too tired to figure out how to live without you." Frank's words were punctuated by sobs that seemed to come from the deepest part of his soul. The man who had spent his entire career projecting strength and confidence was completely broken, reduced to a grieving friend who couldn't accept that the most important person in his life was gone forever. "I don't know how to do this without you," Frank continued, his hands gripping the casket as if he could somehow hold on to Dean through physical contact. "You were the one who kept me grounded when the whole world was telling me I was bigger than I really was. You were the one who reminded me who I really was when the world tried to make me into something else. You were the one who loved me even when I was impossible to love, even when I was angry and cruel and pushing everyone else away." The mourners in the chapel were transfixed by Frank's raw display of emotion, many of them crying themselves as they witnessed the complete psychological collapse of a man they had never seen display vulnerability. This wasn't the controlled grief of a professional entertainer fulfilling public expectations. This was the authentic anguish of a man who was confronting the loss of his most important relationship and discovering that all his fame and power meant nothing in the face of genuine loss. "Remember Vegas," Frank whispered, his voice becoming even quieter, each word a struggle against the emotion threatening to overwhelm him completely. "Remember those nights when we owned the world, when we'd finish a show at the Sands and the whole city felt like our private playground. Remember how we used to laugh until our sides hurt. Remember how you always knew what to say when I was ready to throw everything away. I need you to tell me what to say now, Dean. I need you to tell me how to live without you, because I don't have any idea how to do it." Frank's breakdown was so complete and so heartbreaking that several of the other mourners began crying simply from witnessing his pain. The sound of his grief filled the chapel, not the theatrical sorrow of a performance, but the raw, primal anguish of a man whose emotional support system had been torn away. This wasn't just a friend mourning another friend. This was a man confronting the end of an era, the close of a chapter, and the beginning of a loneliness that he knew would last for the rest of his life. "I'm scared, Dean," Frank admitted in words that few people had ever heard from him, his voice now so quiet that only those immediately beside him could hear. "I'm scared to be alone. I'm scared to be the only one left who remembers what we had, who remembers how we really were when nobody else was watching. I'm scared that when I die, no one will remember us the way we really were, not the public version, not the legend, but the real us, the two guys from nowhere who somehow ended up ruling the world." Frank's confession of fear was perhaps the most shocking part of his breakdown. Throughout his career, Frank Sinatra had been synonymous with confidence, control, and unshakable self-assurance. Hearing him admit to being scared revealed the depth of his vulnerability and the extent to which Dean's friendship had been essential to his emotional survival. "You were supposed to wait for me," Frank concluded, his voice now barely a whisper. "You were supposed to wait." Frank remained collapsed beside Dean's casket for several minutes, crying with an intensity that made everyone present understand that they were witnessing something profoundly private and sacred. When he was finally helped back to his wheelchair, his face was streaked with tears, his composure was completely shattered, and his hands continued to shake with the aftershocks of emotional trauma. The remainder of the service was conducted in an atmosphere of profound emotional intensity, as Frank's breakdown had stripped away any pretense of formality and replaced it with raw human grief. When the service concluded, and the mourners began filing out of the chapel, Frank remained beside Dean's casket, unwilling to leave his friend for the final time. Frank's breakdown at Dean's funeral became the defining image of their friendship's end, a moment that captured the depth of love and loss that had sustained both men through 4 decades of shared experiences. The words he had whispered to Dean's casket, his confession of fear, loneliness, and dependence, revealed the emotional foundation upon which his entire life had been built. Frank Sinatra lived for 2 more years after Dean's death, but those who knew him said that he was never the same. The man who had survived the deaths of numerous friends and colleagues couldn't recover from losing Dean. Frank's own death in 1998 was seen by many as the final chapter of a friendship that had been too deep to survive the loss of either partner. The heartbreaking whispers that Frank had spoken to Dean's casket became part of entertainment legend, a reminder that even the most successful and confident people are ultimately vulnerable to the loss of authentic love and friendship. Frank's breakdown proved that some relationships transcend professional success, public image, and personal pride. They become so fundamental to a person's identity that losing them is like losing part of oneself. In his final years, Frank often spoke about looking forward to reuniting with Dean, as if death was simply the next stage of a friendship that had defined both their lives. When Frank died in 1998, many believed that he had finally gotten his wish to rejoin the friend whose loss had broken his heart beyond repair.